In the 1800s, syphilis was a common public health risk. 1 in 5 Londoners had it by the age of 35. So in England and Ireland, the government appointed, quote-unquote, police officers who could stop any woman whom they had good cause to think might have syphilis. These women then had to submit to an internal medical examination. The inspection was described as, quote-unquote, voluntary, but police were known to coerce illiterate and underage women into agreeing to it. Later versions of this law made fortnightly inspection compulsory once a woman's name had been added to an official register, or she had to face jail time. J.B. Venot, an authority in the French Department of Medical Administration in 1837, tells us, quote, "It must be acknowledged, in fact, that by this means alone can we hope to reduce the ever-growing number of cases of syphilis in women whose vice and poverty has set them outside society." End quote. Great man. Initially, these examinations were undertaken using a cold metal speculum. Remember, keep this in mind, the speculum. It was a device that enables opening up a woman's vagina and looking inside. The leading syphilis specialist of the era considered the speculum to be an indispensable, quote, instrument of medical control, end quote. However, prostitutes in France called this device the government's penis, while in Britain, women termed it instrument of rape. A woman who was registered as a prostitute in 1870 tells us, quote, "Often they use several speculums," she meant. "They seem to tear the passage open first with their hands and examine us, and then they thrust in instruments, and they pull them out and push them in, and they turn and twist them about," end quote. One can only imagine the nightmare that women faced while walking on the streets when any man could pick them up and conduct this quote-unquote examination. Keep this in mind as we now begin to share the story of Agnodice of Athens. When you first Google her name, Agnodice of Athens, this is the image that comes up. This actually is not Agnodice. This actually is Marie Boivin, a 19th century French midwife. It was she who used the stethoscope on the fetal heart for the first time ever. It was also Marie Boivin who invented a pelvimeter and vaginal speculum, but this one was a significant improvement on the previous one. So, ladies, a minute's silence for her contribution to saving our lives and to some extent our dignity too. Why does her face, Marie Boivin's face, come up when we Google Agnodice, who was actually an ancient Greek woman? Madame Boivin was one of the most important women in medicine in the 19th century. She was called the archetypal female embodiment of Agnodice. Similarly, Sophie Jex-Blake, a medical student in Edinburgh University, used the following passage to help support her argument for furthering women's education in medicine. She said, quote, "History of Agnodice, the Athenian maiden whose skill and success in medicine was the cause of the legal opening of the medical profession to all the free-born women of the state." End quote. So, who is Agnodice and what has she to do with women in medicine? Agnodice is said to be the first female doctor ever in the history of the Western world. Some versions of her story say she was a midwife, while other versions say that she was a doctor, depending on who is telling the story and to what purpose. Because, you see, the tale of Agnodice has been used by women to support their role in medicine since at least the 17th century. And why the 17th century? Because it was around this time, 17th century, that the right of women to be midwives to assist births started to be challenged by men. It was also then that most versions of Agnodice's story become primarily a midwifery story. So let's come to the story of Agnodice. The main version of her story goes like this. In ancient Greece, women practiced medicine to a limited extent. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, in the 5th century BC, wrote the first ever medical texts. These books tell us that women were active doctors. They were not free or equal to men by any chance, God forbid. For example, women were not allowed to attend public meetings, but practicing medicine was one freedom that they were allowed. Hippocrates didn't take women in his main research center on the island of Kos. There he only took male students, but he ran another school in Asia Minor. There women could study gynecology and obstetrics. After Hippocrates' death, Athenian lawmakers found women doctors doing abortions. How dare they? So they barred women from medicine, and midwifery became punishable by death. Because of this, Greek women began losing access to medical care, so that by the time Agnodice was born in 300 BC in a wealthy Athenian family, death rate among Greek women was high. Appalled at the high mortality rate of infants and mothers during childbirth, Agnodice decided she wanted to study medicine. But because the Greek law of that time forbade women and slaves from practicing medicine, Agnodice decided to disguise herself as a man. She cut her hair short and she started wearing men's clothing. She received her training under a doctor called Herophilus, and upon completing her training, she started seeing patients, all the while remaining in disguise as a man. On one occasion, Agnodice visited a woman who was in labor. Agnodice, like always, was disguised as a man. The woman was uncomfortable with the male doctor examining her. So Agnodice revealed herself secretly as a woman to this patient. Once Agnodice treated this woman well, it was like a secret bond established between them. And soon enough, it became a secret shared among all Athenian women that Agnodice was in fact a woman. See, she soon became the only choice among female patients who preferred her over male doctors, because obviously the women were more comfortable discussing their health, particularly their reproductive health, with her. As more and more female patients would insist on only consulting with Agnodice, other doctors, who were all obviously males, grew suspicious. And the only explanation they could come up with to justify why the women wouldn't consult them except one other male doctor was that Agnodice had illicit relations with these women. They suggested that the women were not really ill, but had been pretending to be ill in order to see Agnodice. Of course, another doctor taking over your patients is no crime. So there was nothing the male doctors could do about it. What was a crime though was producing illegitimate children, and that's the chance the male doctors pounced upon. In the ancient world, women's bodies were policed to ensure that they did not engage in pre- or extramarital affairs which would compromise the legitimate family line. So the doctors accused Agnodice of posing this risk to Athenian men. Their argument was that Athenian women only wanted to see this one doctor because they were all in an affair with this doctor, and thus this doctor posed a threat to all Athenian men and their family lineages. So when this matter was taken to court, a group of judges summoned Agnodice, accused her while she was still in disguise as a man, remember, of improper behavior with her patients. Instead of arguing long arguments, Agnodice simply undressed to show that she was in fact a woman and was therefore incapable of impregnating women with illegitimate children. Despite Agnodice having revealed herself as a woman, the doctors continued to be outraged. It was only when the women of Athens stormed into the court and defended Agnodice that the law was amended to ensure that women could practice medicine in the future. So that's the story of Agnodice. And now you know why she is invoked repeatedly by women in medicine. But was Agnodice real, or is this a myth? The story of Agnodice is a great story. It's inspiring. It generates just the right emotions within you to want to get up and do something. But is this history, or is this just a myth? In other words, what are the actual historical facts? There is actually enough evidence suggesting that Agnodice was a mythical figure, or is a mythical figure, one should say. And there are many reasons for it. Firstly, an Athenian law which banned women and slaves from practicing medicine did not ever exist in any period that we know of. In fact, women, primarily enslaved women, were often trained as midwives and physicians because male doctors tended to avoid physically examining a woman's body. Secondly, the only place where we find reference to Agnodice is in Hyginus's Fabulae, a collection of myths and biographies of mythical figures. Hyginus is a notoriously difficult figure to pin down historically. We don't know when he lived, and while Fabulae exists in Greek, it was almost certainly translated from Latin. Thirdly, Agnodice's story has many parallels with ancient novels. For instance, her bold decision to remove her garments in order to display her true gender is a relatively frequent occurrence within ancient myths, to the extent that archaeologists have unearthed a number of terracotta figures which appear to be disrobing dramatically, like Baobo and Phryne. Finally, her name, Agnodice, translates to chaste before justice, which is a reference to her being found innocent of the charge of seducing her patients. It was common for characters in Greek myths to be given names which directly translated to their circumstances, and Agnodice is no exception. Finally, it's no wonder that the legend of Agnodice has become the beacon call for women to study medicine, especially reproductive medicine. Legends are an important part of our history. These legends, these stories have accompanied us in our lonely moments. They've inspired us in difficult times and saved us when nothing else could. Civilizations are built on shared stories. They give us our shared morality, our shared understanding of what's good, what's bad, what's worth fighting for, what's worth saving, what's worth changing. Stories act as a mirror for us as a collective and as individuals, showing us our flaws, our biases, our scars, our failures, and in that, challenging us to change things and aspire to be better. Stories represent history, but they are not history. History needs to be ripped out of these stories and legends because they tell us something deeper, something that even history in all its directness fails to tell us. These legends bind us together across the space of time, like Agnodice's story did for women who were picked off streets and had their vaginas ripped open by men in the name of public health, to the women who had no choice but to be at the mercy of male doctors when midwifery became punishable by death. It's these legends that bind us together. They may not be history itself, but they are part of history.